Com ja veieu, la presentació anirà sobre el rècord Continuum, per tant, fem el Continuum de sessions també, non-stop. Us presento el Greg Rolan, que serà el ponent d'aquesta sessió. Greg Rolan és investigador postdoctoral al Centre per la Informàtica Organitzacional i Social de la Universitat de Monash. Monash, així, silenci, sisplau. Gràcies. És llicenciat en Física Aplicada i Ciències de la Computació i després de més de 30 anys de carrera, diguem, informàtica, va passar al costat fosc, diguem, de l'arxivística. Ha fet, per tant, estudis de màster i doctorat i justament la seva tesi doctoral, que porta per títol From Archives to Participatory Record Keeping, Transforming Record Keeping for Interoperability, va rebre el premi del Vice Chancellor's Commendation for Doctoral Thesis in Excellence l'any 2017. Aquesta tesi essencialment forma part o està incardinada en un projecte més gran del govern australià que té per títol Archives and the Rights of the Child, que és una iniciativa de reparació jurídica, moral, històrica, etc., de tots aquells nens en acollida que van patir abusos. I una de les potes molt importants d'aquesta iniciativa és fer-ho a través dels arxius de la gestió documental. Essencialment l'hem portat perquè ell ha dissenyat un model teòric de participació, o millor dit, d'arxivística participativa, en funció del grau d'agència, agency en anglès, de capacitat de relació amb la documentació. I, òbviament, també està molt interessat cada cop més en la relació del que diuen el record keeping informatics, que és aquest nou vessant que proposa integrar ja d'una manera clara els principis de l'arxivística amb aquest nou entorn digital. Òbviament ha guanyat diversos premis també per les seves recerques que podeu mirar en el currículum vitae. Doncs, sense més dilació, Greg, when you can start.
Okay, so bon dia a tothom. Actually, m'agradaria començar donant les gràcies a l'associació i sobretot al comitè científic per la seva amable invitació. Estic molt emocionat d'estar aquí i parlar-vos avui. Fins aquí el meu pobre català. Ara amb el vostre permís seguiré anglès. So today I'm going to be talking about rights in records and how to design systems that support these rights. And I know that this is a topic of interest for the association, and I hope I can make it interesting, and even for those that are not maybe very technical or have thought much about rights. Back home in Australia, I would normally start a talk like this by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And this sort of acknowledgement of land or acknowledgement of country is not unique to Australia, but it's done in many post-colonial countries such as Canada and New Zealand. Now, beyond politeness or guilt over colonisation or political correctness or virtue signalling, this acknowledgement is actually a very deep and powerful act. First, we recognise other stakeholders in the land. And secondly, we recognise a sense of continuity beyond the immediate transactions from history into the future. But most importantly, we acknowledge claims of moral rights that are separate from legal ownership. And somehow these rights are bound up in ties to land that are the basis of memory and identity and culture. And I would argue that the same rights are bound up in similar ties to records. In Australia, after a long legal fight, we have the idea of native title, recognition of Indigenous Australians' moral rights over land. And ironically, Indigenous Australians don't think about ownership, they think about stewardship of the land, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I say all of this because if we can separate the idea of rights and obligations from legal title of land, maybe we can do the same for records. And maybe with land, ownership is the wrong paradigm for records, or at least the wrong basis for establishing and maintaining the rights over records. So, in order to deal with rights in records, we need three things. First, we need to understand how to move from a traditional creator, owner, subject, and user of records to a more general participation of rights in records, of multiple stakeholders. Secondly, we need to understand how to systematise this participation. And in particular, we need to understand how to document records to support participation. And thirdly, we need to understand how to justify specific rights in records. And I'll cover all of this by talking about some of my research and the research project I'm currently working on. I'm interested in two things. The first is a theoretical basis for participation and rights in records. And secondly, a practical design that meets the technical challenges for standards and systems. But I've only got 1 hour, 40 minutes, 35 minutes. So apologies if I go too quickly or there's translation problems or my Australian accent is difficult. But firstly, a detour. I often say I'm not an archivist because most of my career has been in IT. I've worked in big corporations, I've worked as a consultant, I've worked as a product manager, and as the founder of a startup. I came back to study as an older student, and I'm now a research fellow in the Centre for Organisational and Social Informatics at Monash University. My group looks at archives and record keeping, community and developmental informatics, information cultures, and so on. And my speciality is in record keeping systems design. So to be clear, I have never worked as an archivist or a records manager, but I have spent the last few years thinking about how to design systems to do this stuff better. So that gives you an excuse to take or leave what I have to say. Okay, enough about me. We've long known that records, beyond their role as artefacts of cultural heritage or transactional evidence, are core to personal and community memory and identity. And yet for hundreds of years, as we heard this morning, we've designed and built our record-keeping systems, and I'll come back to explain what I mean by record-keeping and system in a moment. We've built our systems around ownership and control, around collections of records, around a singular intellectual as well as physical control. Not only who has access to the record, but what the record means and how it should be used. And that's a problem for two reasons. Firstly, people, families, organisations, and even whole communities are often separated from their records, from their memory, identity, and culture. And this can manifest as small moments of personal inconvenience to ongoing social trauma. And secondly, we've come to understand that in order to exercise our rights, universal rights as well as specific rights of children, of refugees, of Indigenous peoples, and so on, we need agency over the information that affects us. In other words, for our human rights, we need rights in our records. So the question for me is, how do we formally understand stakeholders in records that are separate from owners, creators, subjects, and users? Who are they and what do they need? How do we design systems that uphold these rights? And bigger questions, what does this actually mean for archival science? What does it mean for practice? Now, this is a really hard problem. It turns out that it's really difficult to answer these questions when we think of records as things, as end product artifacts sitting in an archive somewhere. And I'm talking about, physical paper things as well as digital things. Because it's too easy to apply the ideas of exclusive ownership to a thing. And I argue that records have a continuum of use from conception onward. So to begin to answer these questions, I've got to take another detour and dive into the records continuum. One of my professors, Professor Suma Kemish, often says that Australian record keeping is both the oldest and youngest tradition in the world. In Australia, Indigenous oral traditions have preserved records for tens of thousands of years. Colonial records have been around for a much shorter time. Our nation, Australia, is just over 100 years old. And our National Archive, as an institution, is less than 60 years old. So without a documentary tradition, early Australian archivists could pick and choose ideas and systems from around the world, and importantly, develop their own. And what has emerged is an understanding known as the records continuum, which has significant differences from the traditional life cycle models of records and archives. Continuum thinking started with the Australian series system for archival description in the 1950s. Instead of textual finding aids, the system used cross-referenced archival documentation. And in recent times, this idea has caught on in various jurisdictions, including Spain, I must say, and Finland, but most recently with the ICA records in context models for archival description. And I'll talk more about these schemas later. Note that this approach allows documentation of records outside of archival custody, the post-custody that we heard about this morning. And note that this leads to the logical conclusion that these systems can manage active records as well as records in an archive, and even records that have not been created yet. We can create a documentation system that anticipates the records being created. And yet, it's this consideration of records in a global way that led to the continuum. So a bit about the continuum. At its most basic, the records continuum represents a spreading out, a distanciation through space-time. The distance from when a particular trace was conceived or created to be perhaps captured and organised in a system and made available for use. At any moment, the documentation of the record describes its past and its plans for the future. Whether a record lives as an idea or in a transactional system, in a records management repository or in an archive, it is a record and needs to be treated as such. Simple. So here's the records continuum model, or one picture of it. Some of you may be familiar with it, may recognise it. It was created in the mid-1990s at Monash University and is an attempt to capture the complex intellectual treatment of records, particularly digital records, and to reflect the Australian record-keeping experience. The model comprises 4 dimensions that represent this distanciation through space-time. It specifically identifies the creation, capture, organisation, and pluralisation, or making available of the record. Now, these are not hard boundaries, and some researchers or theoreticians have suggested other dimensions, such as curation or reclaiming a record. What is important is the idea of distanciation from an originating record-keeping act, and a different focuses on the record-keeping business depending what your point of view is. The 4 axes, identity, eventuality, transactionality, and record-keeping containers correspond to our record-keeping concerns. You can find the origins in traditional archival diplomatics. Who is in the record, what is about, what is it evidence of, and so on. Progression along each axis leads to greater aggregation or generalization, from individuals to institutions to society, or from documents to collections to the archive. We can use this model to analyse record-keeping scenarios. For example, the behaviour of existing systems or the design of new ones. This model doesn't deal with rights, but it does make us consider who is identified in the record and what it is evidence of. And we must consider how these manifest through time. There are a couple of other points I'd like to make before continuing. I've been using the term record keeping, which I take to mean all of the conceiving and creating and managing and using records in a continuum of use. And it's one word. And when I say system, I mean a socio-technical understanding of human activities and social structures and technology. We can't just think about technical systems, we need to understand how they interact with people and practice and policy and the law and society. But don't confuse this with records management. Record keeping, one word, encompasses all of the range of activities of current and active records as well as what happens in an archive. Okay, so the continuum model explains how records manifest through time and across space from an initial record-keeping act. Where do rights come in, particularly as the records continuum model talks about record-keeping systems and things and ownership? Well, one clue is the recent emergence of the term participatory record-keeping. Participation is a term borrowed from community development, which I'll turn to in a moment. The term participatory, again, does two things. Like the acknowledgement of country or land I spoke of earlier, it recognises there are other, perhaps many, stakeholders in records. It's also used to describe stakeholder involvement in record keeping, from, at one end, maybe being able to write comments on an archive portal, to the return of records to individual or community control. So how do we get from general ideas about participatory record keeping to a theory that supports the needs and rights of stakeholders? A starting point might be to consider participation in development. How are people involved in development that affects them? Perhaps NGOs in developing countries or urban renewal or so on. There have been a bunch of analyses performed, and each of these show levels of participation increasing from bottom to top. And it appears there are four main levels of participation: non-participation, transactional involvement, recognition and cooperation, and empowerment or control. So how does this apply to record keeping? The literature is full of lack of trust and rejection of invitations to those disenfranchised from records. Even archival services that provide simple annotation and social media functionality may have failed to recognise the complexity and divergent needs of participants. So what have we been missing? So remember that the records continuum model reflects the through time nature of records. And it's this time aspect that is crucial to record keeping. And here is the most important point of my talk. It's buried here in the middle, but I'll keep mentioning it as I proceed. If we are interested in understanding about how records manifest in society, we must stop thinking of records as artefacts, as things, as end products. Rather, as, for example, Jeffrey Yao from the University College London explains, records are representations, we heard that word this morning, records are representations of time-bound phenomena. I'll say it again. Records are representations of activity, of things that happened. So record-keeping design needs to move away from classifying records as things towards documenting the ever-changing relationship between things that happen, the people concerned, and the records that capture and represent this participation. I'll come back to how we document this later on, but for now, let's focus on people and activities. So we build a continuum model based on distantiation again, but this time not of the record from when it was created, but the distance between people and the activity that affects them. If we consider the activity or event being represented, then we can identify stakeholders and what the record might mean to them. So here is another continuum model based on those 4 stages of participation that I just discussed. Thinking about the distance from the event, the shortest distance is for participants who have directly experienced the event being represented. The record represents a portion of their life. In some cases, as I will talk about later, the record may be the only memory of their life. They may feel a sense of ownership of such records. They may have the deepest need for involvement in the record keeping. They may be most affected by the loss of access to records. An example in this space might be a recipient of child protection or welfare services that had records written about their childhood. The second dimension, identify, people may not have directly experienced the event, but may still identify as part of their ongoing lived experience. They may not need full control over the record, but they may need to control the description of and access to such materials. And a good example here is community and the community's records. Participants may relate to an activity that does not form part of their lived experience, but they might have a significant connection to the records. They may wish to annotate or contribute additional material and to be identified as being done so. And an example here, in Australia, we had a World War I website that was set up by the National Archive, and people could contribute photographs of their grandparents or stories or letters and so forth. Finally, participants may be interested in records from an intellectual perspective. They may require transactional access to material and the ability to create transformations, such as transcriptions, translations, minor corrections, and so on. An example here might be an academic researcher. However, the term research may include formal researchers, but any intellectual, artistic, or infotainment interest in records. But remember, this is a continuum, so there are no hard boundaries here, and I'm sure that you can think of other sorts of participation that could fit here. These form a continuum from proximity to detachment. Think of it as looking from the record out to looking from outside the record in. Understanding the involvement of people, we can draw axes that correspond to their needs. What agency do they need? What form should the records take? How record-keeping systems should interoperate to support participation, and so on. And there may be many stakeholders, each with different perspectives, and possibly competing needs in record keeping. So this model gives us a basis for understanding multiple stakeholders, participation in the record keeping. We acknowledge that records are representation of events and track the relationship between people, the events, and the meaning of records. Is the record core to someone's identity and memory? Is it of research interest? Does the participant need power to create or destroy the record, correct it, annotate it, control access, and so on. Okay, so if we now know the ways in which record-keeping systems are supposed to support multiple stakeholders, how do we document records to support all of this record-keeping business? And again, the key here is thinking about records as representations of activity. If we look at the history of archival description, often recognised in our standards and systems, we can see a progression in conceptualisation of records. And we can break it down into sort of 3 stages thus far. The first is artefact description, and this is the finding aid. We're describing records as things. A textual description expressed in ISAG and EAD encoding. It's a bit of a problem to make systems because those standards are so loose that it provides no scope for systematic documentation of records. The Australian series system was the first, but there are obviously others leading up to the records in context model of today that involves documenting contextual entities such as organisations, functions, and so on, that exist separate to the material being described. And these are the structured metadata schemas, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, such as implemented in the Australian series system, the Spanish and Finnish standards, ISO 23081, and more recently in records in context. This modelling is still artefact-oriented. We're still documenting things, but we do introduce what Chris Hurley describes as doers, deeds, and documents. The downside to this model, or this type of schema, is the model constrains us to a knowable set of things that can give rise to inhospitable schemas, a mapping to fixed vocabularies. For example, the agencies or functions described in a metadata schema may not match the experience or language of all stakeholders. I'll come back to this shortly. And so the third stage is activity modelling. Right? It's modelling records as representations of activities like I've been describing. A record may describe many activities, an activity may be described by many records. Here we're concerned with expressing human activity and participation. And we need to differentiate between purposeful enactment and indirect involvement. Somebody might do something, but there may also be indirectly affected parties, victims, bystanders, and so on. And so for this, we need an understanding of the records continuum. Activity modelling has yet to make it into international record-keeping standards, although some jurisdictions, and again I mentioned Finland, are beginning to think in this way. Significantly, activity modelling allows us to embrace multiple worldviews that allow all participants in records to be represented and potentially participate in record keeping. So, what does stage 3 activity modelling look like? I don't have time to go into detail here, but I will mention several requirements. The first is that we understand that we are not documenting collections of items. We're modelling part of one large interconnected network of activities, participants, and records. And this means that interoperability of our systems and of our metadata is a first-class requirement. And for metadata to be interoperable, we need to take notice of technologies such as semantic web and so on. But remember, this network is a contested space. The participation of multiple stakeholders means that these interoperable systems must be able to deal with multiple and probably incompatible documentation that might be used for arrangement, description, discovery, access, and so on. And the second is it must deal with records as representations, acknowledging there are multiple different stakeholder viewpoints. What this means is you and I may not agree what an activity is, or we may not agree what a record is, or what the record represents, or what an activity is represented by. And this is a much bigger problem than agreeing to common metadata standards, or even of metadata crosswalks. I'll give you an Australian example. How do you deal with the record keeping around the removal of Indigenous children from their families for cultural assimilation? How do you reconcile records that are classified as Aboriginal welfare with a community understanding of child abduction? What activity do the records represent? What terminology should be used? What are the roles of the participants? And so on. The single institutional documentation does not satisfy the needs of all stakeholders. So if we're to consider rights, then along with activities and record keeping, we've got to be able to document distinct people and roles and organisations, because the relationship between the law and policy and records and these sorts of agents are complex and change over time. And they directly affect the way we can negotiate conflicting rights and record-keeping activities. One way of approaching this problem is through meta-modelling. So a meta-model generalises properties from all models up into a generalised meta-model. And the purpose of the meta-model is to define the design constraints and rules for all systems so they can work together. It doesn't specify what the schemas must be, but it's a meta view of the schemas. And so here is one such meta model for record-keeping metadata. And I don't have time here to describe this in detail, but I want to point out a couple of important features. You'll see that, do I have a pointer? Well, you'll see that there are three main entity types in here: substantial, performance, and non-concrete. So substantial entries are physical things that exist in the world. Mountains, trees, buildings, people, machines, computer systems, items, series, collections, fonts, and so on. Note the aggregation of substantial entities are also substantial. And record sets are arbitrary. One person's record might be another person's record set or collection. There are no natural aggregation hierarchies. I'm glad I'm not the first person today to say that. There are no natural aggregation hierarchies, such as series, record groups, fonts, collections, and so on, for all stakeholders. I use the term performance here as an umbrella term for things that happen. They unfold in time. They can have a duration and temporal parts. It's convenient to consider three types of performance: unbounded activities like healthcare, point-in-time events that have a time, and a process that has a start and an end time. And these distinctions form a spectrum of granularity. From one perspective, a war, a bank transaction, the accessioning of a collection of records, the digitisation of a photograph may be all considered to be events. Alternatively, they may be considered as a complex cluster of events and processes in their own right. Again, it's up to the beholder to decide for themselves. And there are non-concrete entities, non-physical, social objects. They often owe their existence to speech or document acts, such as agreements, laws, policy, and so on. And we document non-concrete entities in ways that we don't document individuals. Non-concrete entities often discorporate agents such as nation states, corporations, organisational units and roles. And they can exhibit agency and can enact performances. And quite often, it's these performances and discorporate agencies like organisations and records that have the most interesting and complex relationships. So I won't go into all the other entity types, except to say they're all semantic. This means that all record-keeping metadata can be expressed in terms of these entities. And it's quite a small, it looks complicated, but it's actually quite a small number. And by doing this, they enable us to link between different schemas and systems. Now, the most astute amongst you will notice there's no record entity. And this is really important and perhaps the most challenging part of the model. And if I could change one thing in existing record-keeping schemas, it would be the removal of the record entity, or collection, or fonds, or series item, and so on, and replace it by a representation relationship. A record may represent many things that happen, and something that happens may be represented by many records. And this representation can change over time. And using this approach, my conception of what is a record might be different from what your idea of a record is, but we can still use the same meta model to describe our different schemas and connect them together. And because we can model all of this under one meta model, one set of rules, then a world of possibility opens up for how we can support different perspectives and rights and records. I'll give you a really, really quick example. The wedding of Robin Hood. Imagine there were three different collections with three different schemas, three different sets of documentation, using different terminology and different records that all represent the same sort of thing. We can map all of these to the same meta model. So we can use our existing documentation, but again, map them to a meta model that describes all of this. And because they're now using the same semantics, we can construct links between the different sets of documentation. And interestingly, we can use any entry point into any of these different schemas to search and follow links around all three sets. And in our research, we've actually done this with different sets of data. Okay, so up to now, I've talked about how we can conceptualize and document participatory record keeping. And much of what I've spoken about is my own research and writing for the last few years. But for the last 2 years, I've been working as a research fellow on the Rights in Records by Design project. And I'd like to spend a couple of minutes describing this project and then getting on to specific rights themselves. So, the Rights in Records by Design project is about children in out-of-home care. Over the last century or so, about 500,000 Australians have experienced out-of-home care as children, being sent to orphanages, foster care, residential care, formal kinship care, and so on. In Australia, more than 80 government inquiries have been held into the circumstances of care, more than 25 inquiries in the last 20 years. Most of these have identified systemic problems in record-keeping infrastructure that affects the lives of children in care or people that have left care. However, the recommendations remain largely unimplemented because our existing standards and systems cannot satisfy these requirements. In testimony after testimony, care leavers have highlighted the difficulties they have faced in finding and accessing records in the search for identity and memory, reconnecting with family, holding the child welfare system accountable, and seeking redress for abuse and neglect. Records of care are often lost, fragmented, and incomplete. The records to which they've been denied are often used by others, in particular academic researchers. So imagine if you approach the The state is, I would like the records of my time in care. The state says no, or the state gives you a set of records that are heavily redacted, and then soon you're called up by a researcher saying, I have your records in front of me, could we talk about them, please? This really happens. Records are made and kept during care are often used as evidence to rationalise further interventions and so on. So, rights and... Did I go right back? Rights and Records by Design is a 3-year project with funding from the Australian Research Council. And what we're trying to do is conceptualise the policy and technical infrastructure for rights-based record keeping. We're designing a lifelong living archive for child out-of-home care. We're based on principles for acknowledging, respecting, and negotiating multiple perspectives on rights and records. The core investigators in this project are archives and record-keeping people, with social workers and early childhood education researchers at Monash University, and also the Collaborative Research Centre in Australian History at Federation University. We also have a wide variety of partners in academia and the broader community, in archives, information technology, the arts, law, education, social work and history. And we bring together care leavers and families and carers to ensure that we can apply the expertise and living experience as needed. So, we've held interviews with care leavers about the records of their care experience. We've also been interviewing professionals that are designing systems. We've conducted anonymous professional attitude surveys. But my main job is to co-design with the care leavers and lead a team to build a lifelong living archive. And at the moment, we're in the middle of prototyping this new system. It's important that we get a historical perspective, that we can identify values and principles. And our historical and social work collaborators help us understand the record-keeping issues that relate to the political and social purpose and function of welfare. And similarly, an education perspective informs the project as well. At the centre of the work is the development by Professor Sue McCamish, Frank Golding and Dr. Anthony DeLewis in a Charter of Rights for Childhood Record Keeping. And the Charter is a statement of individual and collective rights derived from a wide variety of sources, including philosophy of the child, historical justice, human rights statements, charters of children's rights, legal instruments, and so on. So we actually spend a lot of time doing legal analysis on a whole lot of different sources and have derived a set of human rights, common human rights that have come across from these sources, particularly for childhood, which is to do with identity rights, cultural rights, memory rights, and accountability rights that expand on the basic United Nations rights with which you might be familiar. We then map these to specific rights in record keeping, in participation, in access, in privacy, in safe record keeping, and proactive disclosure. Again, we derive these from a variety of sources. And we look specifically for references to records and record keeping in these statements of rights. And we also analysed where agency or participation in record keeping is necessary to exercise other rights. Now, this charter has an intrinsic value as a fundamental mandate and guide for how we should be designing record keeping systems. But also, it's kind of the requirement statement for me. It'll be the systematization of these rights that will be developed as a rights engine at the core of the lifelong living archives. Okay, so I'm almost done, but I'd like to leave you with a question about provenance. Participatory record keeping, as I've defined, can provide pluralistic evidence of activity richer evidence, not only of administrative business, but of all participants. We move from a single intellectual description of a record to network stewardship that enables participatory engagement. This doesn't dispense with whatever arrangement and description that archivists may do, but allows a diverse version of evidence. That is, as Isto Huvila argued, conscious, explicit, and hospitable about their and others' epistemic beliefs and real options. So in the shift towards stewardship and multiple intellectual control, the archival threshold now becomes the point at which the material is stewarded in a participatory way. From a continuum perspective, this is often at capture, but of course could be at any contextual point in the continuum. It may not be until the record is organised or even pluralised. And the implication of this is merely putting a record into an archive does not itself ensure the pluralistic intellectual stewardship of the record. However, in dispensing with a hard threshold to custody, we open ourselves to some new challenges. Perhaps the main one is the shift from the closed world logic to that of the open world. An open world assumption means there is no single version of truth. If, in the semantic web, anyone can say anything about anything, this raises big questions about authority, trust, and the deterministic nature of record-keeping systems. If we redefine provenance, so we admit a plurality of perspectives, how do we judge evidence in the face of multiple, perhaps competing interpretations? Is provenance contingent? I agree with Clay Shirky that the semantics are in the users, not in the systems. In an open networked world, the attribution of claims of provenance is as important as the claim itself. Even so, given a variety of provenance claims or contexts, how do we determine which one to accept? Without a single authority, we are left needing mechanisms for inferring trust amongst network actors. And in fact, as we found, there may be bad actors as well. And this is the next deep, fertile area of research for multiple provenance and trust. So, is there hope for the disenfranchised in records? As is the case with all wicked problems, there is no simple answer. But I hope I've demonstrated the foundations for our approach in rights-based record keeping, and that we can design such systems to better serve the stakeholders in records. We've covered how to move from traditional creator, owner, subject, and user roles to a network of multiple stakeholders and activities in records. I've described a meta-model for record-keeping metadata that lets us systematise this network. And I've explained how our project is methodically justifying the record-keeping rights that underpin human rights. Whether or not this approach will have a broader impact is an open question. There remain big professional, societal, and economic challenges. And there's also much more that needs to be investigated before we can claim a successful transformation to participatory record keeping. And our research provides a way forward, but what we need now is the will to take it. Moltes gracias.
Thanks, Rolan, for your speech. No sé si teniu alguna pregunta sobre el model de gestió documental participativa o algun altre dels aspectes de la relació dels drets. Alan? No.
Jo no ho podré fer en anglès.
Ja traduirem com podrem. No t'allarguis gaire per això. Be synthetic, my friend.
Aquí a Catalunya hem tingut un problema similar. Un segon, deixeu-me. Tenim el fenomen de nens robats, concretament a Terrassa, que és a la ciutat on jo treballo, i tenim un problema a l'hora de poder donar testimoni d'aquests delictes. D'acord? Llavors, jo pregunto, en el cas de Right of the Child, com veu poder detectar? Hi havia testimonis documentals? Ho veu poder detectar?
I per començar tenen el suport polític, que és la gran diferència. He was asking that here in Spain we got we call it here the stolen kids. In South American dictatorship regime also, I mean, and the problem that he was pointing is that we don't have the political will in favor. So the privacy rights and all this stuff block us to show records, and the worst is that we usually don't have records to show because they've been destroyed or we don't have access. In your case, in Australia, how do you prove or have proved the abuses and all this stuff related with children? Or have you got problems to show them? What did you do?
Yes. Big problems. Through the colonial times, the colonizers were very meticulous in records. In more recent times, it's that as sometimes the expectation of government is to be open, the government becomes more closed. And in fact, so there was 100 years of stolen generations, and there was a big government inquiry in 1990, a government report. There are now, today, more children being removed than there was in 1990. So the problem is actually getting worse. And they're becoming cleverer about the record keeping in all of this. But the problem still is that the records are all about welfare. It's a language of child protection or Indigenous protection and not in real child welfare. So part of what our project is about is, again, we're working with lots of activists and advocates to try and change. But it has to change not only the record-keeping system, but a policy and law. I gave some evidence to the government inquiry a few months ago, but it is really hard. But I can imagine that the absence of records can be is actually devastating for families. We have some people who have been in child protection that have no records at all, and they ask the question, how can it be? How can it be I can have a whole childhood like that? So it's still big problems. I think I have the easy job. I have to design a technical system that shows how it works. And I can say, here's the system that works, now you go and solve the political problem. But yeah, I agree, it's a significant problem.
John Sheridan, I think that...
I'd like to ask you about money.
You guys have a lottery.
Well, so the point being that I can see that there are lots of merits, and there's lots that's very appealing about the position that you outline in terms of rights and records. But it comes with a consequence, and the consequence, it seems to me, and I'd be interested in your reflections on this, is that when you don't have a conception of a record with ownership, you don't have a conception of an asset that someone is on the hook for writing the check against to do the record-keeping work, for protecting the asset and exploiting the asset. And there isn't an economic argument that you can pitch to a finance ministry. And these peoples in finance ministries, treasuries, they're quite hard to convince to write checks to do record-keeping work. And language around assets tends to work better than other kinds of language for writing the check to do the work. So what's the argument in this world to the finance ministry for writing the check to do the work? And if it's not them writing the check, who is it?
John, that's a really interesting question, and particularly for me, because I actually think that, from what I understand, the British National Archive is actually close to this sort of ideal. I don't think you guys, I don't think you're a profit centre, are you? Yeah, so you've managed to monetize a portion of all of that, and some of this, I forget the name of the project you described before, is that kind of thing. But I don't think. I also think there's a duty, sort of a nominal duty, as the custodian of this material, and to make it available. I guess what I'm arguing for is, being the custodian shouldn't give sole intellectual right for its description.
Who pays? I mean, that's the problem. Who puts the money if no one is the owner? I think that's what you're asking, in short. I mean, in Australia, you got what I've read. I mean, you've got the government decision, a political, a public policy, and then I suppose funds to put this.
I guess the question is, would your fundraising be difficult if part of your mission was to open up an API to let other people document the records in the way they see fit? And that's what I'm arguing. That's what I'm arguing for.
But the Treasury, who funds us, would be hard to persuade if we used language other than, these are public assets and we protect those assets in the archive. And the reason that you give us millions of pounds is so that we can do the work of protecting these assets. So my point is that you lose the argument that you can place around protection of assets as the case for giving the money to do the record-keeping work that allows all of the other things to happen. When you lose the notion of property right, now I have huge sympathy for what you're saying. It's just that in reality, you have to make a case to a finance ministry to write you a check to do the record-keeping work, and that comes with language of assets and ownership.
Yep.
Whether we like it or not.
Sure. I guess all I would say is that doesn't apply universally, in my opinion, morally, to all of the records held. Some of them aren't your records to hold, aren't the institutional records to hold. But that's not a new question. It goes back to the.
We cannot.
You can be here all day.
We cannot kill provenance still because we don't get money if we. Yeah. Anyway, we can.
Anyway, I'm standing between you and dinner, so.
Yeah, now it's time to stop and continue the interesting argument not argument, I mean discussion. Sorry. in the dinner. Doncs bueno, ja tanquem, que tenim tots molta gana. Intentarem a les 3, començar el més aviat possible a les 3, 3:10, i hi haurà doncs, 2 sessions paral·leles. Val? Vinga, gràcies a tots. Thank you.
Gràcies.